Okay. All right. So, yeah, I mean, basically all I wanted to do today was just show you some stuff that is, Steve was sort of describing to me the scenario that you guys are building an application in with, a WPF desktop app using WCF for communications and the requirement to access both remote server-based data through the WCF service and local data and so on, and talking about, the whole issue of what can be done in Synergy, what should be done in C#, and all of those questions. And I wanted, one of my concerns was that I think Steve was, and an email that I saw a copy of, was talking about some example code that we, or I think, provided or built at some point that ultimately went into the code exchange. And that was, I think the time frame for that was maybe a month or so before our conference, so it was kind of in the September time frame last year. A lot of stuff has changed since then, and there's a lot of things that you can do that we've figured out that you can do. There's some new capabilities that are in the version of the product that I've got, but not that you've got at this point in time. We're doing a 951A patch in March. And one of the things that will be in that patch is some additional project templates in Visual Studio, as well as a whole bunch of language stuff and, a whole bunch of bug fixes and so on. So I just wanted to just take a little while. I'm not thinking this will take more than 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but if we need longer, that's fine. Just to walk you through some of the stuff that can be done. I didn't quite get to the full scenario that I wanted to achieve. There was one additional thing that I wanted to do that I was unable to do because of, I'll be quite honest, because of a bug in the compiler right now. So what I've actually got in this solution, let's first of all just run it and show you what, okay, I'm on the wrong one, I apologize. Let's do this one. This is what the little demo app that I've, and this has been completely thrown together from scratch since our conversation yesterday. So it's not very rounded in some areas. I did not have time to put the MVVM pattern in there, so the example code here is code behind, not view model, and so on. So I'm not trying to cite this WPF app as a good example of the way you would do it, but it's an example of some of the technologies and WCF and caching local data and that kind of stuff. So all the client does is it has the ability to display data from a local ISAM file that is stored in the user's profile local to this instance of the application. We have the ability to delete the content of that local ISAM file. Now if we try and display it again, it's gone. We also have the ability to go off through WCF to a service and pull back the server's copy of the data and display it in this grid, and in doing so that data is also being cached to the local ISAM file. So again, if I clear the grid, all that does is just take the data source or item source assignment off the WPF grid and display local data. Now we've got our 6 records in local cache again. And again, I can delete those, display local data, nothing there. So I'm basically manipulating content of a local ISAM file and going out through WCF to pull the server's copy of the data. Haven't done anything in this time frame with synchronizing and what happens if I change this record and pushing changes back to the server. That was, that obviously that's getting more advanced, and just purely didn't have time. But it was mainly I was mainly wanting to address what can be done in Synergy and how does it look and what's the experience like and what about WCF with Synergy and things like that. So to step through what that does, you'll see there are 4 projects in this solution. One of everything starts with WCF services, and WCF services is a Synergy class library. I think the examples that you guys had previously looked at were using a project template that was based on something called an Interop project. And in fact, when you do a file new project and the options under Synergy D, now again, you're going to see some additional ones here that you guys haven't got yet. If you need them, I actually created these additional project templates, and I do have a V6 installer that you could install them into the current release of Synergy.net, but in the A patch in March, they will be part of the distribution. And I think what you were basing things on in the past was this Interop project, and that kind of makes things a little bit more complicated in some ways, because what the Interop project does is it allows you to add regular old good old Synergy subroutines and functions that expose Synergy traditional data types, alphas and decimals and I4s and records and things like that. And the idea is that if you've got existing XF Server Plus code where you've got all of those existing just Synergy subroutines and functions that were being exposed through xfnetlink.net, and obviously, obviously what those tools do is put a C# wrapper around those Synergy APIs and Synergy data structures and bundle the whole thing across the TCP/IP connection. The idea is that the Interop project, you drop the existing XF Server Plus source code in there, and it creates OO wrappers like GenCS would have done in the old days, but those wrappers are Synergy. But the idea is that you essentially can factor out xfnetlink.net and XF Server Plus and the TCP/IP connection, primarily if you're in an entire, a Windows-only solution and you just want to get rid of that TCP/IP layer. So that's really what that Interop project was about. But one of the things that you can do with that Interop project, in fact, let me just create a new one so we can look at this. Come on, Synergy. Interop, that'll work. One of the things that you can do in the Interop project is in its project properties you can check a box that basically says, where is it, generate WCF contracts. And all that does is it attributes, in addition to creating the wrappers similar to what GenCS would have done for xfnetlink.net, it also attributes those the procedural classes as a operation contract and operation, I forget what the exact attributes are now, and it attributes the Synergy data classes as data contract and data member. And essentially what that allows you to do is very easily expose all of that wrapped up subroutine and functions with its OO layer around the outside of it through WCF directly. And when we did this 5 or 6 months ago, that was pretty cool because we could take an existing XF Server Plus environment and basically do away with the XF netlink and the network layer and also still go over the wide area through WCF directly. But it was kind of a complex environment. Some of there's extra layers there and extra work going on to massage the data from the Synergy types to the .NET types and so on. So it was a cool thing to do if you were starting with current XF Server Plus code, but if you weren't, then it wasn't really a particularly good solution, and it looked kind of ugly, and there was that whole generated code folder and what's all that about, where does that come from, and so on. So what I wanted to do was show you what you can actually do directly, which is much more akin to, if you were just going to build out a client-server application with C#. This is much more similar to what you would be used to doing in that environment. So that's where this project that I've built up from yesterday comes in. I'll happily send you a copy of all of this stuff, by the way. I can zip it. It's all kind of in and below a directory. So when we're done, I'll zip it up and get a copy to you. Did I pick the right one? I guess I didn't. So back to the project that I was going to show you. As you can see, we've got 4 projects in there. The first one is WCF Services, and this is a Synergy class library. Nothing particularly special about it. It was created using one of the new templates. So again, you'll find in the A patch in March, and again, I can give you these templates ahead of time. There's a file, new project, and if we look under WCF, we've got a Synergy WCF service library, and that's actually what this is. Now, the only difference between a regular class library and a WCF service library is when you create, in fact, let me show you what happens when you create one of these guys. It's just a class library, but it has some things pre-configured. So you get an example of an interface that defines the external interface for a WCF service, and you get an example of a data class being exposed as a data contract, and you get an example implementation of a couple of methods, get data and get data using data contract. And these interfaces and classes are essentially exactly the same, the Synergy version of what you would do if you said, I want a new WCF service library in C#. It's basically the same stuff. Don't particularly like these examples. They're kind of silly, but they're exactly the same as you get in the C# world. And the other thing, the other difference is that you've already got a bunch of pre-added references for runtime serialization and system service model and all of those things that you need in order to make WCF work. So that's really the only difference between a regular class library and a WCF service library. So let's go back to our actual demo again. So that's what this WCF services project is. It creates just a Synergy assembly. We've got in there all I'm doing is dealing with one ISAM file. So as part of my project properties, I've got some logical names that point to my my repository and my dat colon where my data file is going to be located. So we can go off and run the repository, and in there you'll see that I've just got one record, very simple, called person. It has a few fields, an ID, a name, a last name, and an email address. It has 3 keys defined on there, and there is a file definition which specifies the physical file and associates it with the record. But that's it. So it's just basically a single ISAM file with 4 fields in it. What I did then was I wrote a little class that allowed me to wrap that record up in native.NET types rather than alphas, decimals, and integers. And normally, if I were doing this for real, we've got, and I'm sure you have, I know you have as well, you've got code generation tools. Generally, I would have code generated this class from my repository definition. But all this class has in it is it has a private instance of the person record using, here we've got a global structure coming in from the repository. We've got an instance of that structure, so mPerson is a struct field, a person record. We've got a constructor that allows you to construct an empty one, a constructor that allows you to pass in individual fields, and a constructor that allows you to pass in a record to create a new person object. And then we just expose the fields through public properties as you would with most data items. And you'll notice again that these things are attributed. We've got system runtime serialization being imported, and these things are attributed as data contract and data member, just like you would in C# or VB. So this is essentially this data class can be serialized and sent across the wire via WCF as a result of these attributes. So what the service does, we've got our interface, of course. Good practice to with WCF to define the interface and then implement it. This is the contract essentially that the WCF service is exposing. So here's our service contract on our interface, and I've just defined a couple of methods. There's a getPerson method where you can pass in a person ID and it returns the person object for that ID, and then a getAllPeople method, which is actually the only one the client's using right now, which just returns a generic list of people objects back to the client. And then the implementation, as you can imagine, is pretty much straight Synergy code. So here's our getPerson, just opening the file and doing a read of the record and returning it. And then the more interesting one that we're using from the client is the getAllPeople method. So again, it's just got an out parameter, which is a generic list of person. And again, it opens the ISAM file, reads through the data, populates the people collection, and which is obviously an out parameter, and also returns a Boolean true/false, so it returns a false if there's any kind of error. So very, very simple example of a WCF service, but you'll see that it's much more of a native thing here. I'm not using the interop and the Synergy subroutines and functions and then generating the wrappers for those in the generated code. It's just straight native code. So these Synergy routines being directly, obviously having full access to your existing data files for your application and full access to your repository and all the other stuff that you've got in place, and being directly exposed as WCF methods in a service. Okay, so that's the first step. We've got this Synergy assembly which exposes a WCF service. The second step, I was hoping to be Synergy as well, and within a few days it could be. But what I found was normally another one of the new project templates that we've got is a new project Windows, no, I believe it's up here actually. We've got a template for a Windows service. Okay, so what this is going to do is produce a Windows service that you can run on a host system, and the idea would be, generally if you're doing WCF and it's not a web application, most people don't particularly want to have IIS as a requirement simply to host a WCF service, and there's absolutely no reason to do that. I think in the examples that you saw previously, there were two flavors of that example. There was one that was hosted in IIS, or in a website at least, via ASP.NET, and then there was also one that was hosted in a command line program. And the idea would be, generally, if it was a production environment, what you would normally do is create a Windows service instead of the command line program, so that you can have the thing start on boot and automatically run in the background and that kind of stuff. So so generally what I tried to do was use a Windows service to host the WCF service in exactly the same way that your example that you've already got uses that command line program. But I did unfortunately run into a bug. There is a particular attribute that's needed relating to some of the WCF stuff, and unfortunately it causes a runtime error. Right? It all compiles correctly, but when you try and start the service, it's unable to load some of the types, some of the attributes that WCF needs, and so on. But development are working on that right now. So had this demo been maybe a week later, the second step would have been a Synergy Windows service hosting the Synergy WPF service, WCF service. Sorry, is that a question?
Yeah. Yeah. When you say it's a service,
yep.
Can you access that? One of the requirements would be that somebody's out in the field and all they've got access is not through a VPN, but just to, through the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different. It's a service, but it's a Windows service running on the machine, but it's hosting a WCF service that's exposing an HTTP endpoint. So it's still listening on HTTP server name : whatever port you decide. It's just that it's not. Okay. It's just that it's not IIS that's hosting it. It's a Windows service.
And does that then spawn off different processes for every connection, or how does it handle all the multiple? It just creates multiple threads or something. Is that all done in the?
Yeah, it's all under your control when you configure the WCF service. By default, I think. Well, let me think. By default, WCF, I believe, spins off a thread for every new request. If you prefer, you can set it. There's an attribute that you can put on the service contract. Where are we? iService 1.
The main thing is it will handle simultaneous requests coming in.
Oh yes, it will.
That's not.
Yeah.
And so there's no real difference or benefit of putting it under IIS compared to a Windows service.
No, I mean,
except that there's one less configuration issue.
Exactly. I mean, you're just giving, with IIS, you're just giving yourself more configuration to do. Yeah, and more things to look after. Yeah, I agree. By default, it spins off threads to deal with each connection, and it spins off a new thread for every request. So every time you make a request, it fires up a thread, runs it, and closes it down again. You can implement sessions so things stay around longer if you want, and you can also implement a singleton pattern where there is only one thread and requests will queue up for it. But it's under your control, and all of that is determined by additional parameters on the service contract of the service that you expose. Right. Okay, so
to know those attributes, there's documentation inside of just normal .NET stuff, is there?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you were to look up, this attribute is actually a system.serviceModel.serviceContract attribute, which is a class. So you just look up that class in the normal .NET documentation.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so generally I would have had a Windows service to host this, but what I've actually got is similar to one of the examples you've already got. So this project is it was created via a empty ASP.NET web application. So and it's, as you can see, it's C#, because we don't have Synergy web templates as yet. So this is a C# ASP.NET website, and within there, all I've got is the SVC file. So this website has a reference to my Synergy WCF services assembly, and then all that's in here is this SVC file, which basically says language is Synergy, and it points to the namespace and class of the service that we've just looked at, basically. And that basically just exposes, if I do a set a startup project.
How did you add that in there?
All I did.
Get that in there just by doing the reference?
No, all I did was I said new project, C# web, empty web application, and then I added the reference to the other project, and then I did a add new item, WCF service, gave it a name, and that obviously adds a C# WCF service. So then what I did was I said, okay, I don't need the interface, I don't need the C# implementation, and all I need is this. So I changed this to Synergy and pointed it at the appropriate. Yeah, sure.
This all worked fine on my machine with pretty much the exact same setup as what you've done here.
Right.
But I tried to take the SVC file over to another web server that was running IIS.
Okay.
And I installed .NET 4 and Synergy 951 and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And when I came up to actually bring the SVC up in Internet Explorer,
right,
it said Synergy was an unknown language.
Okay.
Have you seen that without all the development environment installed on machine?
No. The question I would imagine the issue there was, if we go back to the actual one, this is hanging together locally, and I'm able to just say assembly dot, where are we, in the SVC file, I can say WCF services dot service 1, because I'm in a development environment with a reference to it, and that reference is actually a project reference to here. I would imagine the issue you probably had was that it probably wasn't able to locate the assembly that you're pointing it at. So you would probably, let me think, you would have to have either copied the, if you think about what gets built when you build this, where are we, temp, BusinessCraft, web host, bin. So when you add the reference, there's the WCF services that it's copied into the website's bin directory. So you would have had to have provided that to the web.
I thought I brought it.
Right. It's possible It's possible you might have had to have put it in the GAC as well, but I'm not sure. I don't know if you do it.
The error that was unknown language or language not supported or something, which seems to think what we thought was, well, on the development machine, we've loaded in the extensions for Synergy for Visual Studio. Is there some component in there that needs to be added into the final environment?
I see what you mean. Oh, I wonder if there is. Yes, that's possible, actually.
So have you done any? What we need you to do at some stage is to take your test project, put it onto a raw final machine that doesn't have Synergy or Visual Studio.
Yeah, I think I know what the problem is already. Actually, when we do the Synergy language integration installation, I believe it updates machine.config, and that is probably where the language is registered. Yeah, okay. Let me write that down.
We may need to have just a set of instructions to say this is what you need to do on your final production machine if you don't install. I don't imagine we want to install Visual Studio and stuff like that on a production machine.
Yeah, okay. What did it say? Unknown language. Yeah, I bet I know what the problem. I bet I know what the problem is. I bet what we need to do is we probably need to make the core components installation update the machine.config file to register the language, and I bet it's not doing that. Language. Okay, I've made a note of that, and I'll go talk to the appropriate guy as soon as we hang up. See if we can get that resolved for the
I
APAC
like
as well.
the idea of running it as a service rather than running it under IIS.
Right.
I mean, that
Yep.
certainly,
Yep.
the less levels and layers, the better.
Right. Okay, so we've got our WCF service, we've got our web host, which ultimately would be a Windows service. The next step is, the requirement is that you're having a WPF client, and the one thing that we cannot do right now, and it's really unfortunate, the reason for it, and I'm not just trying to point fingers, the reason is actually a Microsoft bug, is we don't have, and you've probably noticed this already, we don't have add service reference in WPF projects and WinForms projects. And the reason for that is, if you're in a C# project and you do a add service reference and it brings up the dialog and you point it to a URL of the service, what it actually does at that point is it code generates a client-side proxy code for that WCF service based on the WSDL file and adds that stuff kind of in hidden directories underneath the project so that it gets built. And in theory, and the tool they actually use to do that is actually a command line tool that's part of the Visual Studio tools called svcutil.exe. So Visual Studio, when you do an add service reference and pick a URL, it actually does an svcutil to generate the source code. And in fact, if we go to the DOS prompt and type svcutil, which this is the program that actually generates a service reference, you'll notice that one of the parameters it has is language equals. And in theory, we are a registered language. We use this thing called code DOM, and you'll notice that this is looking for a code DOM provider, which we have. So in theory, we should be able to say service util /language : Synergy, and it will generate all the proxy code, all the client-side wrappers in Synergy syntax instead of C# syntax. Unfortunately, even though Microsoft say they support language equals whatever, they've hard-coded it to only support C# and VB. So that is and it doesn't, as the help say, take a code DOM provider. So that's something that our development team are currently working with the Microsoft Visual Studio people on, and hopefully when we get a resolution to that, we can very quickly add service reference. But for the time being, we can't. However, there is a workaround, because all Visual Studio does is literally, if we were to go take our, web host. So if we run this is going to run the web host for the WCF service, and it's going to hopefully show us the service. If we take the URL for the WSDL and go to a Visual Studio command prompt somewhere and say svcutil and point it at the WSDL file, then it will generate for us all the client-side proxy code that's necessary to access that WCF service, and it will also give us the configuration information that's necessary. So again, as a workaround right now to the fact that we can't do add service reference, the third project in here I've called Service Proxy, and all it is a class library that's got the output from, in fact, here's the batch file that I used to make it, service util. So I use service util to generate the C# proxy code, and that also generates the config information that I need in my app.config for my WPF application. And I add that into this project. So here's the proxy code that gets generated by service util. This is the service reference essentially. And then what I do is build that into a C# assembly, and literally that's the only code that's in there. It's just the client-side proxies for the data structures and the operation contracts that the WCF service exposes. So again, I've got a little thin C# layer there in an assembly, and here's my WPF client, which is obviously a Synergy application. Oops, why did I do that? I didn't want to do that. Set as startup project. And what I've done is I've added a reference to Service Proxy. So Service Proxy and WPF Client are the client side of this application, and WCF Services and Web Host are the server side. So I've just taken what Service Util gave me in C#, put it in an assembly, and referenced it from my client application, and that gives me the ability to be a WCF client in my Synergy application, even though we don't have ad service reference. And from that point on, if we look at the code of the application, which is incredibly ugly, basically all this code is doing is we've got some local data which basically holds a channel number for the file. I calculate a local data folder and a name for the local ISAM file, and then on launch in the constructor I go off and get the application data folder, so that's going to be under users, my username, app data, roaming, and then I add on a BusinessCraft demo folder and then calculate a file name in that temporary folder, or not that temporary folder, but that user profile folder, make sure the file exists, go off and create the ISAM file if it's not there, and open it. So now I've got a local copy of the ISAM file as well as the copy that's exposed through the WCF service. And then in the various button click methods, I'm just going off and calling routines. So get remote people. Here's where I'm calling the WCF service. You'll notice I've got I've imported WCF services, which is the namespace of the proxy. So from that point on, it's pretty much like calling WCF services in C#. So here's where we make the get remote people call. It's a local method that just says, give me an instance of service one client. So there's my local proxy. And then I svc.getAllPeople. And if it's successful, call cache data locally. And cache data locally just clears the content of my local ISAM file, reopens it, and then stores all the records that came back from the WCF service in the local ISAM file. And get local people just basically reads through the ISAM file. Oh, and it also binds the data to the WPF grid. And the get local people just read S's through the local ISAM file and binds the results to the grid as well. So, you know, from the point of view of once we've got past that service proxy, that's that little thin layer that we have to have in C# still. Pretty much we can do everything in Synergy that we can in C# with the remote WCF service, but we also get to use remote ISAM as well and all of that kind of stuff as well. So that was, you know, that's what I wanted to show you guys. It was the fact. It seemed to me that the whole Interop project and its generated code and its old style subroutines and functions with that old way of coding was kind of clouding the issue a little bit and making it a little bit more complex. And I just wanted to show you that, you know, you can basically implement the WPF and WCF stuff, albeit, like I say, with this little thin proxy wrapper right now. You can pretty much do the whole thing in Synergy very natively, just the same as you would. Yeah. Sorry, Steve.
That proxy layer, they'll end up being underneath the WPF client once that issue is sorted out.
Yes. If we had, you see, this assembly, if you remember, this assembly was created. I did a service util from the WSDL, and that gave me this C# code. If I had, and the reason I'm doing that and adding a reference into my client is because I don't have right-click add service reference. If I did, then that exact code would be part of the client project, although it would be hidden away in hidden folders, and it would be Synergy code, not C# code, basically. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Okay.
And you have to regenerate that proxy class whenever the contract changes.
Yes,
right?
Basically, you would regenerate it whenever the contract changes. So whenever you make a change to the interface, that's when you would have to regenerate that proxy.
And
well, actually, not just the interface. It would be the contract, and of course, bear in mind the data is also actually part of the contract. In fact, a lot of developers actually embed all the data structures in the interface file as well, so the whole contract is there in one file. And that's I don't particularly like that, but I guess in terms of knowing when the contract changed, it's probably a good thing.
Okay. Now, the other reason for having the WCF services as a class library is so that way you can host the same service within different hosts. So at the moment you've got a web host, but if you want to support a web host, a console host, and the Windows service host,
Right.
then the WCF services is not changing, and the host is really just a small wrapper around that. Is that
Exactly. Yeah, the host program is just going to take one consistent WCF service, and it might expose it with different endpoints, different network protocols, different encryption mechanisms, all of that kind of stuff. And basically, by having it as a separate assembly, you're just factoring out the actual service from how it's exposed to the outside world, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a good design to do that. So we wouldn't want to try and reduce down the number of projects. It makes sense to have them as separate
In
assemblies.
fact, yeah, I mean, in fact, if I were doing this for real, I would have at least one more project, because if
testing one.
well, no, okay, two then. If this were done for real and it had more time, and this was using MVVM patterns, then my view model would also be in a separate assembly normally. And that's right. Recommended practice to separate to have the views and the view models in different assemblies, basically.
And there's, previously, we've created our view models in C# because we didn't have the Synergy available.
Right.
So there's nothing to stop us from starting to create view models in Synergy if we so desire.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's no technical reasons why we can't.
No, absolutely, and a good yardstick is a good thing to do. Another good reason to separate out the views from the view models in separate assemblies is it makes it really easy to take a look at the view project, the WPF project, and make sure you've got absolutely zero code behind in there. And if you're finding that you've got any, and I mean any, code behind in the XAML files, you're probably not doing something right. So separating them out and having the rule that all thou shalt have in this project is XAML, basically, is a good way to keep track of that as well.
In your contract, what's the right way to handle login details and authentication details? So we obviously need to say what company we wanted to talk to, what the username is, what the user's password is,
Yep.
potentially a company password. So we've got 4 pieces of information that we may need to supply
Right.
in order to authenticate ourselves.
Yeah, it really depends on how you want to go about it. There's really no right and wrong way to do that. I've done examples of both. One way you can do it is to turn on the. Well, there's actually a couple of ways. If you're going to host it in ASP.NET, then you can, if you want to, one way of doing it is to leverage the session support that ASP.NET provides. So if you wanted to have the concept of a login call that then generates some kind of token, and maybe the login returns a GUID token to the client, and the client has to return that GUID as a parameter to every subsequent call, and there's some code in there that validates that GUID is still valid or something. That's one way of doing it. Mm-hmm. Another way of doing it is to use the WCF. Has some session support that you can turn on. Again, it's all controlled through attributes. You can say that this session uses state. You can specify. Let me think about this. I forget exactly how it works now, but you can specify which methods cause a session to be created and which methods require that a session is already in existence. So, for example, if you did have a login method, you can attribute that method saying creates new session, and then you can attribute all of the other ones. Or in fact, I think the default is that they require an existing session, so they can't be called unless a session already exists. And then you can persist information.
Timeout.
Yeah. To be honest, I've never. Yeah, to be honest, Steve, I've never actually. I'm on about chapter 4 of my WCF book right now, and I haven't got that far. Right. I don't know.
You know where we can search for getting information on that, or what book you think we might read?
I am currently reading, and I'm very happy with it's a Rox Press book, the red ones, and it is entitled Professional WCF 4 with .NET 4. The ISBN. I'll give you the ISBN and you can Google it. It's 978 0470 563
Zero.
Sorry. Okay, 978
Yep.
470
Yep.
563
Yep.
144.
Yep.
And they do have an iPad. They do have a Kindle version available as well if you want it online.
Yeah, I don't have Kindle. I've got iPad.
Yeah, but you can.
So rocks. And what was the name of it?
It's called Professional WCF4 with .NET 4. And it's pretty good. It's a fairly comprehensive walk through what WCF's all about and you know, SOA generally and stuff like that. So it's a pretty good read. Another way of doing it, obviously, is just to pass that information with every call. You know, you might not want to have state in ASP.NET or have state within WCF. And, you know, if that's the case, there's really not, as long as the information that you need, you know, the user and password and so on is relatively brief, then there's not that much overhead. It really depends on how much overhead there is in authenticating that information once you get to the server. But in many cases, it's pretty reasonable to just pass that information backwards and forwards all the time. Obviously, make sure it's an in parameter, not an in-out or anything, and then it's only going on the calls and not coming back on the response.
But then how do you stop people from seeing that information if you did it as clear text? That's not good.
Well, that again is all down to what protocol you. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that might be a concern. Maybe you encrypt it in some way yourself. Maybe you run the whole thing through HTTPS. You know, generally the way that most people encrypt these kind of services, if it's based on the HTTP protocol, which is all, you know, actually the other bit we didn't look at is when we generated the service proxy, the other part that came out of service util was the config file. And all I did was I literally cut that system.service model out and I added it into the application's app config exactly the same. And what this is doing is exposing a basic HTTP binding. So when you read up on WCF, basic HTTP binding is basically SOAP over HTTP. So you could, you know, if you were running your server on HTTPS, then you could happily just put the whole thing through HTTPS, and there you go, you're encrypted. But one of the nice things about doing it this way is, you know, you might want to. You discussed the other day the concept of the user being online or offline. Well, there's actually a third common state, which is, you know, they might be offline, they might be online remotely, or they might be online in the office, essentially, on the local area network. Yes. And in that case, and one of the great things about WCF is what you'd probably want to do is expose a second endpoint on the service, and this would be done on the wherever you're hosting the service, essentially. But you would host a second endpoint that uses maybe the WSTCP binding, I think it's called, or something like that. The book will tell you all about it. But what you're doing by doing that is you're saying, I'm not going to use HTTP. I'm going to go directly over a TCP/IP socket to a local server. Obviously, you can only do it over a local area network. But by doing that, the TCP bindings automatically pass. They basically pass the data not as clear text XML, but they translate it all into binary and all kinds of things, so it's significantly faster. And so
it doesn't detect the best and choose the best way, does it?
No, you would have to put some code into your application to detect where you were through some mechanism.
Right. And then use the right endpoint.
Right. In Silverlight, it's easy because Silverlight will tell you I'm online, I'm offline, I'm connected, and all that kind of stuff. But you would have to probably put some kind of logic in there to detect, I don't know, from the network address that you're given or something like that, whereabouts you are. Or maybe you would try, you know, maybe you would have it on when your app opens. Maybe you could make it try connecting to the TCP binding and have a 3 or 4 second timeout and then fall back to the HTTP binding or something like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, guys, that was just my thoughts on the subject and what I wanted to show you. Any questions from anybody out there?
I don't know if it's really an appropriate question, but
Okay.
our main challenge is that all looks good. It looks a lot better than what we were given from
Right.
September or whatever it was.
Yep.
But the main thing is we've got some really old subroutines. They're sort of 15, 20 years old, and there's a huge amount of code behind them. And we could just bring this all across to an L and just basically write a wrapper routine and just call old subroutines through XF Server Plus.
Yes.
Whereas this way, we've got no real way of exposing those really old subroutines. It's hundreds and thousands of lines of code. So we're a little bit stumped as where we're going to head to call those really old subroutines.
Right.
So,
Well-
just to add my 2 cents in there, you're talking about on the server, on the web host side of it, I would believe. Is that
That's
what you mean,
correct,
John? Yeah. So in the web host where
Yeah,
it says
that's correct,
get the situation where it said get all employees or get all contacts, that was pretty easy. That's just doing some reading and looping through.
Yeah.
And you could almost generate code and that wouldn't be too bad. It's where we then have methods that do a particular process. So one example of this application is they do what's called an event registration. So when they register an event, it's got to go through some code and do a whole lot of business logic.
Right.
So yes, you're allowed to do it based on conditions, and then it updates data and it sends off emails. Rather than try to move that over into this into the web host is just going to be too big, whereas we've already got it exposed as an XF Server Plus call. So I think the question there is that web host, there's nothing to stop us calling XF Server Plus calls from within that Synergy code.
Nothing at all. And if we are talking about existing XF Server Plus code, then maybe that's where the Interop project comes in. But what you might want to do is. Sorry, go on.
But it's not in process.
Right.
Yeah.
What? It's not in.
Yeah, just the main problem with that was...
Hang on. One at a time.
Will I talk?
Yeah, you're blocking each other out.
Yeah. So because it's not in process, because we've got to do the calls remotely, then we can't just get rid of the XF Server Plus layer. But I guess what you're saying is you did it by adding WCF in the middle of that. What I'm thinking is that in our host, stuff that's simple reading of an ISAM file and returning data back, which is going to be a fair amount of it, like populating all the lookup tables and just raw data reading, we can just do like you've done there, maybe with some code generation. And where we've got to actually call procedures, we do that with an XF Server Plus call.
Right. Is your XF Server Plus stuff on a different machine?
It wouldn't be on a different machine, no.
Right. So why would you want to go through XF Server Plus still?
I guess potentially it could be on a different machine to balance the load, but I guess most of our sites will probably be on the same machine.
Right. So what I would look at doing is I would look at building the actual WCF service like we've done here in this example. So we've got this being our WCF service, but there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have an interop project in this solution as well and be making calls on that interop project from the WCF service. Because what that interop project does...
The problem was...
Yeah.
The problem with that interop project was that you need to put all those tags around the subroutines and around the parameters, which we don't have in all our really old subroutines. We've got
a solution to that coming for you. My colleague 4 days ago wrote a utility which I believe he is almost done with. And what it does is it reads so you've got an existing Synergy method catalog, right? For your XF, right? So what Bill Hawkins has done? Sorry, what was that?
We do for certain routines, but then those routines are just wrapper routines around other subroutines, and they're they're not in the method catalog.
Right, but everything you can expose through XF Server Plus today is in your method catalog. And Bill Hawkins has written a program which will read through the method catalog and code generate all the Synergy code with all the attributes and with all the doc comments. So I'm not suggesting you were going to use that, but you could then easily cut and paste the attributes and the documentation comments into your existing routines so that you could use the Interop project. That would save you quite a lot of time.
But then the problem is, from that point, from inside those routines, we then call another subroutine in there, which doesn't have any method catalog. So that's where we get stuck. So we call a QR, which is basically a remote routine, and then inside that we call register event. And that register event subroutine doesn't have any tags, doesn't have any method catalog.
Doesn't have to.
And it just keeps going, cascading down and down and down.
That's fine.
Okay.
Doesn't have to. I mean, you'd have to build them all into an assembly,
Okay.
but it doesn't have to. The only ones you have to attribute are the routines that you're exposing as methods through XF Server Plus. Anything that's below there, obviously, it would have to be compiled into an assembly somewhere, and you could dump them all into the Interop project. I would be tempted to have the Interop project be just the XF Server Plus methods, and then have another assembly that's all of your standard subroutines that those XF Server Plus methods use. You know, but I mean, obviously, that means they've got to be compilable in .NET and so on. But you can get there from here.
Yeah,
that's what we were trying to achieve that, and we were just a bit unsure of where to go from here. So
right,
that sounds a lot better.
I think because of the time constraints on this first project, I would say that the web host we do in DBL, we do all the ones that are simple read routines. We just do in as simple loops like we've got there. Maybe code generate some of them if we can. And then anywhere where we need to do a procedure, let's just call XF Server Plus from the Synergy, just so that we don't get bogged down in the technology of it all.
Okay.
And then later on we can come back and replace that with the Interop methodology.
Absolutely.
After we've done the first project. And I don't think that'd take a big refactoring.
No, absolutely. You're right. You're right.
That way we're not rebuilding with all those old library routines. We just use them in WebLib like they're currently doing through XF Server Plus.
Yep.
And I don't think the time that it's going to take to call that XF Server Plus call is going to be minuscule compared to the time it takes to transfer the data over the network, over the wide area. So I don't see that there's a problem having that extra layer in between, knowing that that layer already works, and we have plenty of people using those XF Server Plus routines.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like a good plan to me. Sense? Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
One last thing, and this might be a little bit difficult to answer, but we also use the toolkit a little bit in some of those XF Server Plus routines. Any word on how we can get around using the toolkit.net?
No.
What part of the toolkit do you use?
Yeah, we use
it for channel stuff.
Yeah, that stuff should work. We do provide an assembly that has got some toolkit stuff in. Where are we? Where can we add it in? Let's add it into here. References, add reference. Wish we had the new dialog because it's so much faster. Come on. What's it called? Synergex. Where is it? Yeah. There you go. Synergy DE toolkit. If you add a reference,
we found that one. We found the version 1 of that one on one of the machines that we got from the SPC demo. So we tried popping up a message box, a U-underscore message, and that worked. But that's as far as we got.
Oh wow! I'm surprised that even worked. As far as I know, what was in that assembly, the idea behind that, if you do anything with UI, for example, your message box, then you're not in XF Server Plus land anymore because you're in a detached process. What I believe is in that routine is things like, or that assembly is things like you start, you finish, you open, you close, e-enter, e-exit. It's basically all the non-UI toolkit stuff. So it should let you open files and stuff. But are you using Toolkit just to be lazy because you open picks a file, picks a channel number for you and stuff like that? But is that really why it's in there and being used? Or sorry, I missed that. What was that?
Pretty much
Just for allocating a channel.
Yeah, you don't do it. Take it out. In Synergy, what version of Synergy are you on? 9.5, obviously.
9.3 is what
Or
we're...
9.3.
Okay.
Starting to go up to 9.5.
Okay. In 9.3, if really all you're using Toolkit for is so you can do a you open, you close, and have it manage channel numbers for you, if you're in 9.3, I'm not sure when we changed this, but in 9.3 you can certainly do an open with a channel variable equals % free chan, and it will do the same thing as you open does. And if you're in 9.5, you just pass it a channel variable number containing 0 to a regular open statement, and it will pick a channel number for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so instead
maybe
of...
you need to refactor out the toolkit.
Right, so I would look at your existing XF Server Plus environments, and if you're really just doing you open, you close, and maybe a couple of other non-UI things, just get rid of it. Just change it to opens and closes, and pass a, if you're, like I say, if you're in 9.3, pass a variable equals % free chan. You've got to be careful because that does not work well in the .NET environment. There's some threading issues there. So for .NET, what you need to be doing is an open statement passing a channel number variable containing 0, and it will allocate a channel number for you.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Because I mean, there's really a lot of overhead from using Toolkit. If you do a U start just so that you can do a you open, you close, and have a channel number picked, you're getting probably 3 megabytes of global data in every user's process just so you can do that. And it's really a lot of overhead.
Yeah, that's worth knowing.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, I think we're pretty good.
Okay.
If we could just get a zip file of maybe the stuff that you've been working on, that'd be really helpful.
Yep, I will zip it up. It does rely, there are some settings both in the code, as you can see here, and in the project properties for WCF services that assume it's going to be in temp BusinessCraft demo. So either extract it to the same place, or you will have to edit the service file, as you can see, the 2 open statements, and I believe the other place that it's got information is in the project properties, UCF services. It's got pointers to the repository and stuff.
Yep, I was pretty familiar with that.
Right, okay.
One,
So
yeah,
I will exit from there, zip it up right now, and do you want me to email it to you as well, Steve, or just to John, or what?
No, just to John. Yeah, CC me. Yeah.
Okay, yep, no problem. I shall do that right now.
Well,
so with that, we don't need those extra template for Visual.
No, it doesn't need them to run. If you want them, let me see if I have a copy of. Where did I put those? In debug. No, where did I put them?
And this wasn't 951A. This was just regular 915.
Yeah, it'll work in regular 951. The only thing you won't have is the new. What I'll do is I'll include in the zip file this PSG VS 2010 standard extensions.v6. If you click on that, what it will do is add the new project templates into Visual Studio for you. Okay. In fact, I should be able to do it even though I've got the other ones. If I do it now, look, it says, yeah, I want to install them. And then when I go into Visual Studio, come on. Boy, my machine's slow. Just ordered some new memory
Not as
today.
slow as mine.
That should give you the file new and the additional items under Synergy DE. What I would recommend you do is all of those templates will be part of the 951A patch in March. Because I'll probably have two. Yeah, you see, from my extensions, they all get installed under PSG extensions. So I've got basically 2 copies of the same thing now. So if you want to install those, by all means, feel free. But what I would recommend you do is when you get the A patch in March, the way you get rid of the stuff again is you go into Tools, Extension Manager, and there's our extensions that I just installed. So once you get the A patch, then uninstall the PSG extensions. Okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, I'll send that to you as well.
Well, Steve, that's been very helpful, so
Good.
we appreciate that. We thank you for your time.
Okay.
And I think that'll give you something to progress with. Yeah.
Sure. Great. Well, it was a pleasure. Keep us up to date on how you're getting on.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Right.
See you.
Bye.